initiatives. My name is Bobby Boyd. I'm the Equity Program Manager for the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's presentation from the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum webinar series. For those that are not familiar with our organization, the forum is a collaboration of businesses and institutions dedicated to promoting practices that advance climate leadership, social justice, and the creation of a circular economy. So today's webinar will be sponsored by Shupan with additional support from Foresight Management. For our next event, the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum will be hosting a luncheon event at the Hawthorne in Holland on Monday, July 24th, about Hawthorne's science-based targets. More detailed about this event can be found at our website, which is M as in Mary, I-S, B as in boy, F.org. Please do consider becoming a member of our forum as well. If you're already a corporate or institutional member of one of our regional programs, a professional MISBF membership is complimentary. If not, you can become a professional member today for only $50. Please email Carrie Veldman there if you're interested as well. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our program for today and our presenter. For our attendees, please note that you can share thoughts and questions with the panelists or all attendees throughout the webinar through the chat function. And we will also have time at the end of this presentation for open question and answers as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our presenter today, Dr.Candy McCorkle, the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Western Michigan University. Dr. McCorkle is an experienced higher education administrator, a professor, and a diversity leader. She is committed to not only sustaining a culture in inclusivity, but also assuring that Western Michigan University is a gold standard for diversity and inclusion. Dr. McCorkle will be introducing her recent research on political weaponization of DEI and how legislatures and other actors are restricting training, positions, programs, and funding at both the public and private institutions of higher education, and the implications for the workforce and sustainable business. Dr. McCorkle, thank you for joining us today, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Okay, good morning, and hopefully I will not bore you all, but we'll give you some information that you might be able to use. I'm going to share my screen as we move through my PowerPoint slides. Okay. Well, you have heard a lot in the news, especially from legislators, this idea of critical race theory. You have seen it in K through 12 school board meetings with parents upset that they don't want CRT taught in their schools. Well, and how they're confounding CRT and diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives as being one and the same, and they are not. So that's what we're going to kind of talk about today, how these two are distinct and how they are similar, and where this is, how this has come about and where it's going and how it's impacting higher ed, therefore will soon impact the industry. So let's look at that. Okay, so today we're going to look at, I'm going to provide context for helping you understand critical race theory. I will define diversity, equity, inclusion, and then outline how CRT and DEI are distinct. They are not synonymous. Also, how the legislation is impacting DEI efforts in higher education. What's the status of various DEI legislation from state to state, and how this will impact industry, and then I will open it up for questions. I am going to leave the questions to the end because it's hard to keep track of the chat and things like that, or see everybody when I'm sharing my screen. So just for convenience sake, try to, if you can't remember your question, jot it down or type it in the chat, and we'll get to it at the very end. Okay, so let's look at critical race theory. Critical race theory is a academic theoretical framework that was developed in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And it comes from the work of Derek Bell, who was a former civil rights attorney as well as a law professor. Well, while working as a civil rights attorney, Bell recognized that every time there was either a legal case that advanced civil rights, or there was a civil rights legislation passed, that legislation would lead to yet more forms of discrimination. Going, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense, that if we're progressing, why are we going backwards? And so we started looking at that and realized that what was happening is racism was such a part of our systems and our institutions that it didn't matter what legislation we came out when it was part of the core of our systems and our institutions. And so critical race theory, as I said, is an academic theory developed to explain how systemic racism is shaped by historical patterns of racism. And so it is not something that is taught in school. It is something literally used to look at systemic racism. And typically the only people who are ever going to use this theory are folks studying civil rights law, or individuals in areas of sociology or counseling that are working at a doctorate level and doing research. It is not something that's taught in schools. Most elementary kids, high school kids, even undergraduate college students wouldn't quite understand it because they're not doing research on systemic racism. So that, I hope that helps you get a real clear idea what that is. It is a way of looking at how systemic racism has been shaped based on patterns of how we have engaged racial inequities throughout our country's history, and how it is such a woven part of who we are as a nation. And critical race theory looks at American systemic racism, but you could probably apply it to other racism in other countries, especially when you're looking at it from a systemic standpoint. So when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, what is that? And my phone is ringing, I apologize. Put it on mute. So when we look at what is diversity, equity, inclusion, well, diversity is very simple. It is the state of being different. That is all diversity means. If you have two people in a room, you have diversity because in some shape or form, they have different attributes. It is also the representation of differences within an organization. So an organization can have people of various ethnic and racial backgrounds. It could have people of different genders, ages, socioeconomic backgrounds, education levels, language origin levels. So all these differences. So that's diversity. It's simply the representation of differences in an organization. Inclusion moves one step further, and inclusion is the provision of space for all to belong, regardless of their differences. So inclusion means we create space for all those differences to exist in that space, to shape that space, to influence and contribute to that space. So inclusion moves past you're just represented to you are an active participant. Equity is something an organization does for those participants. And equity is the provision of the needs for each participant so that they can fully engage in the environment. And so equity is something an organization provides for its participants so that the participants can engage. You'll see the image, and you've probably seen this image lots, where you have the three folks who are standing on the side of the fence trying to watch a baseball game. In the first block of the graphic, everyone has a box, the same size box. And so that is what you call equality, which means everybody gets the same thing. But you'll notice everyone doesn't need the same things in order to see the baseball game. For example, the taller person in the blue t-shirt doesn't need a box to see over the fence. The person in the like a burgundy-ish wine color t-shirt, they do need a box to see over the fence. The person in the light blue t-shirt needs more than one box to be able to see over the fence. So when we move to the second screen, what you see is equity, which is each person is given what they're needed in order to look over the fence. When we talk about DEI in an organization, that is that last screen. And that is where we remove barriers so that people can just engage. And so that last scene is the idea. And I would add one more block to that where they would not be sitting in the grass, but they would be sitting in the stands watching the game as everyone else. That would be truly inclusive. And so when we think about DEI, this is what DEI is about. It is about creating space for everyone to engage. It is not based on someone's particular race, someone's particular gender, socioeconomic status, education level. It is creating space for everyone. Whereas when we go back to CRT, critical race theory, that is a framework in which to study the development of systemic racism. So are you with me on these two are not one and the same, but and they're not synonymous. However, DEI has been hijacked to be synonymous for critical race theory. And you'll see politicians everywhere, using it as a scare tactic instead of really talking about what DEI actually is and what critical race theory actually is. So as I said, the distinctive facts between the two, CRT is a theoretical framework to understand systemic racism. DEI consists of principles, competencies, and strategies for organizations on how they can create space for and to empower all of its stakeholders. Systemic racism is an element of DEI, but it is not all of DEI, which means systemic racism is one of those things that DEI attempts to overcome, but it is not DEI in its totality. DEI and CRT are not synonymous. As I said, CRT has a much narrower focus. It is focused solely on understanding systemic racism. DEI is a much broader focus in which it is studying on how do we create equity across all barriers. CRT is understanding a particular phenomena, whereas DEI is a way of being. So CRT is understanding some particular action or activity, whereas DEI is a way of an organization, a way for a person to be. So those are how they are distinct. And if you're following me, you can see how by not showing their distinct characteristics and you talk about them, people begin to have a fear that DEI means it is promoting one group over another, and that is not what DEI means. DEI is not anti-white, it is anti-inequity, which means it doesn't want inequity for anyone. DEI, a good way to look at it, is a way to help us all get along, a way to help us recognize one another's humanity. It is not something you do for a particular racial group. It is not something you do for a particular gender. It is not something you do for a particular sexual orientation group. It is something you do for everyone so that all may engage at an equitable level. So with that, we see legislation happening to kind of prevent that. And this is where I will say CRT does come into play. So if we go back to Derek Bell's work, remember he started looking at the patterns that anytime advancements were made in civil rights, we saw extra efforts of discrimination happening. So when we see here, you've seen DEI really grow and develop in the last 25 years, especially in higher ed, with trying to create equitable playing fields and allowing space for everyone to engage. Well, that has given rise to what is called the woke kind of movement. And so legislation coming out is an attempt to diminish, silence, and censor that idea of creating space for everybody. So again, what's happening in the legislation is proving to some extent the theory of CRT, of you make one step forward, two more steps are made to prohibit that. So let's look at politicians, they're mistakenly using CRT and DEI as synonymous, and that is not a mistake on their part. It is an intention. to do that, because if I confound what's actually happening, people are less likely to take the time to dissect and separate the two and assume this is what's happening. So it's an intentional tactic, purporting that both of these are anti-white and they will take rights away from one group and give them to another. That is, neither of these things will do that. DEI is looking at the rights of all. CRT isn't looking at rights at all, it's just looking at a phenomena. The current proposed legislation seeks to prohibit DEI in higher ed in the following categories. So it either seeks to prohibit the development of DEI offices and DEI staff, or it seeks to eliminate existing DEI offices and DEI staff. It seeks to eliminate mandatory DEI training or education. There are many institutions of higher ed who are requiring faculty and staff and students to have DEI training so they can better understand how to engage with one another. Well, many of the legislation that's been proposed is proposed to eliminate that. Also to prohibit requiring diversity statements from faculty or students as part of hiring or admissions. Most schools do not require diversity statements for students as part of admissions, but there are some institutions that will require faculty or administrators to submit as part of their application a diversity statement. It's not unlike for faculty, in which they are required to include a research statement as well as a teaching statement to show this is how I approach teaching, this is how I approach my research. A DEI statement is this is how I approach DEI. It is not that that statement has to include certain things. It is more of a way, if an institution values diversity, equity, and inclusion, they want to see how their prospective hires, how they understand that, to see are your values aligned with the values of the institution. So to help you understand why that requirement might be for some schools. Some of these laws also are prohibiting identity-based preferences in hiring or admissions. For example, not that you're giving someone gets in because they happen to be Black or because they happen to be a woman, but trying to balance so that you have representation of all. So many of these legislations that have been proposed are saying we want to get rid of things that appear in those four categories, and they're painting those categories with very broad brushes. And so when we look at some of the legislations that have been proposed, some of the statistics, there are 21 states that have bills that have been proposed or passed or have not passed. 38 of the bills have been introduced since December of 2022. So this has been a rapidly moving activity. Most of the bills have been introduced between January and March of 2023. So a lot happening in a very short period of time. Of the 38 bills, 6 have been approved by the state legislators and sent to the governor. Out of those 6 that have been approved by state legislators, 5 of those have been actually signed into law by state governors. And most will take effect July 1st or August 1st. 26 of those bills have either been tabled, they have failed to pass state legislation, or they have been vetoed by the governor when it got to the governor's desk. So this has been quite interesting to kind of see what's happening here. And so the states in which this legislation is happening are Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Montana, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and West Virginia, with Texas, Missouri, and Florida having the largest percentage of the bills that have been proposed. Texas and Florida having some of the most prohibitive legislation that has been proposed. You'll also notice that a lot of these states are our southern states. When you look at the Dakotas and Montana, These are states that do not have large percentage of racial diversity. And even though there are proposed laws, they're not as stringent as some of the southern states. So it's been quite interesting. Many of these states are, the power is held by Republicans in both their legislation and the governor's office. So hence why some of this is coming out. But it is quite interesting. And I have been following this since January. So been looking at these laws, and the bills that have been signed into law. You'll see I have highlighted Florida House Bill 999. This is the bill that gained popularity, that really started people looking at what's going on here. And so that it wasn't the first one, but it was the one that gained the most notoriety because of what it was trying to do. So what we have here, and I'll go back real quick because I want you to understand. So Alabama has one bill that it has proposed. Arizona has one bill that it has proposed. Arkansas has one bill that it has proposed. Florida has 4. Georgia has 1. Indiana has 1. Iowa has 2. Kansas has 2. Louisiana has 1. Missouri has 4. Montana has 1. North Carolina has 1. North Dakota has 1. Ohio has 3. Oklahoma has 2. Oregon 2. South Carolina 2. Tennessee has 3. Texas has 9 pieces of legislation that it has proposed to prohibit DEI activity in higher education. Utah has 2. West Virginia has 1. Ohio is the only state in which they have moved beyond public universities to also include private institutions. However, Ohio's bill did not pass, but it would have prohibited funding to both private and public institutions that require DEI training or education, used identity-based preferences in admissions or hiring, and required diversity statements. So it would have hurt both private and public institutions. Arkansas is interesting. Although Arkansas's legislation failed to pass, if you have been paying attention to the news, the University of Arkansas has dissolved its DEI office. It has moved its DEI staff into other areas of student affairs. As a result of Arkansas's legislation putting forth their one bill and vying to put forth more. So you are seeing schools start to react. If you looked at hiring in the last 3 years prior to January of this year, you would see tons of DEI positions in higher ed being posted. If you look now, you will see very few. You might see 1 or 2, but very few. Even in states where this legislation is not happening, people are still starting to pull back or pause on hiring in DEI. And some of it has to do with not sure of what's going to happen at our national level, because we do have a presidential election coming up this year, and not sure if we will see things like this happen on a federal level. So let's look at the bills that have been signed into law. We'll start with the wonderful state of Florida with Governor Ron DeSantis, who has probably been the most vocal governor about the anti-DEI legislation. So Florida Senate Bill 958 and House Bill 931 would prohibit public colleges from requiring diversity statements as part of hiring for faculty or part of promotion for faculty or part of admissions for prospective students. It also prohibited identity-based preferences in hiring or admissions. This was signed into law on May 15th by Governor DeSantis. House Bill 999 and Senate Bill 266 were passed, and it prohibits public colleges from using DEI statements that include CRT rhetoric. And I find that interesting because no one has defined what that means. So what is CRT rhetoric or other forms of political identity filters. And so if you start reading some of these bills, what they consider political identity filters are, you are making a statement about where you stand on LGBTQIA+, where you stand on race or racism or any ism. And so that's being lumped into political identity. If you look at the DEI research, we would consider those things social identities, but they have now been compromised. So it would also prevent any reference. What was interesting, though, is that when this bill it passed through the House and Senate, then went back, and there was language that was struck from the bill that was actually passed. So the bill that was actually passed, the following language was removed. So any language which subjected faculty to a tenure review at any time for any cause was eliminated. It struck the reference to DEI language. It also removed from the bill that was passed, it eliminated language giving hiring authority to the governing boards. The original bill, House Bill 999, wanted to grant the Board of Trustees of public universities the right to hire faculty, the right to review courses, to review tenure and decide all of those things. So removing that from the educational process to the power of the governing board, which are not educators. Now, it is common in higher ed that faculty who are being promoted or granted tenure are put before the Board of Trustees for approval, but the Board of Trustees is not literally reviewing those files to determine whether or not they can even enter the process of tenure. And that is something the original House Bill 999 wanted to do. Even though things were struck from that bill, it is still a prohibitive bill and was passed May 15th. So Florida made history by passing two very strong bills last month. North Dakota Senate Bill 2247 was passed on April 24th, and it bans mandatory diversity training and the use of diversity statements for hiring and promotion and admissions. And that will take effect as of August 1st, and it was signed into law on April 24th by Governor Burgum. Tennessee, Senate Bill 102, House Bill 158, ended mandatory implicit bias training. Many universities required implicit bias training for search committees so that as they are looking at potential candidates, they are mitigating bias influencing their decisions. Well, Governor Lee on May 17th passed or signed those bills into law. So now public institutions of higher ed are not allowed to require implicit bias training for any reason. Texas, House Bill 5127, Senate Bill 17, requires that the governing boards of public colleges and universities approve hiring of all top administrators, approve core classes, approve job postings, and also requires the governing board to submit, or the institution to submit annual reports confirming that the institution does not require diversity statements for hiring, promotion, or admissions, and that they do not have DEI offices or staff working in DEI positions. It also requires specific language that must appear in its mission statements, and the language that must appear must denounce DEI types of ideals. So this was signed into law on May 29th by Governor Abbott in the state of Texas. So this really strips institutions of their abilities to move this idea of creating space for everybody from its how it approaches things. One of the bills that have been approved by the state legislature has been sent to the governor but has yet to be signed, and that is Texas House Bill 1. And it prohibits state funds to be used on any DEI effort, such as DEI programs, DEI training, DEI staff. So Texas public universities would not be able to use any of their state appropriated funds for DEI efforts on their campus. So it shows this is getting very scary as to where we are moving. We are now we are censoring information. You'll often hear, I was listening to Ron DeSantis, who said these legislations are returning us to the freedom of ideas. You know, my opinion as a DEI practitioner is that these ideas are doing the opposite. They are preventing diversity of thought, diversity of ideas. It is deciding that there's one way of being and that is the only way. Anything that differs from that is dangerous. And so censorship is definitely where we are moving. So let's look at the bills that have not passed, or they've either not passed or they've been tabled or vetoed. And there are a lot more of them, but I would not say get comfortable with that, because these bills will be rewritten and reintroduced until they get success. So Alabama's House Bill 7 would prohibit the use of diversity statements in hiring, promotion, and admissions. Arizona's Senate Bill 1694 would prohibit the development and maintaining of DEI offices, mandatory DEI training, and the use of identity-based preferences in hiring or admissions. Arkansas Senate Bill 71 prohibits identity-based preferences in hiring and admissions. Georgia House Bill 261 prohibits the use of diversity statements or the requirement of diversity statements for hiring, promotion, or admissions. Indiana House Bill 1338 prohibits mandatory DEI training. Iowa Senate File 81 and House Study Bill 218 prohibits the spending of state appropriated funds on establishing DEI offices or hiring DEI staff. Now, this is interesting because it states on the establishing of these things. It does not address if a school already has a DEI office or DEI staff, will funding be removed? So that will be interesting to see how that plays out. Kansas decided to be a little more coy than the other states. So instead of having a specific bill that addressed DEI, it made its anti-DEI legislation part of its budget bill. And so it prohibited funding for institutions that required diversity statements for hiring or admissions. So if a state university in Kansas required that, if their budget bill had passed, it would have prohibited them using state appropriated funds for those universities if they failed to meet those criteria. Louisiana Senate Bill 128 prohibited identity-based preferences in admissions or awarding of scholarships or financial aid. Missouri had several of its bills not move forward. So Senate Bill 410 prohibited mandatory DEI training. House Bill 75 also prohibited mandatory DEI training, and Senate Bill 680, House Bill 1196 prohibited diversity statements and identity-based preference for hiring, promotion, or admissions. Montana Senate Bill 222 prohibited DEI training. Oklahoma Senate Bill 870 prohibited funding of any DEI office. And also Oklahoma Senate Bill 1008 prohibited identity-based preferences and diversity statements in hiring, promoting, and admissions. Tennessee House Bill 571 would have prohibited colleges offering health-related degrees from requiring DEI training or education as a condition of admissions or degree requirement. And that was put in there is because many institutions that have nursing programs, physician assistant programs, physical therapy programs, occupational therapy programs have as part of its curriculum some DEI training to help future healthcare providers understand how to work with their diverse patients that they will serve. Well, Tennessee decided that that was not necessary. However, that bill did not pass. Texas House Bill 1046 would have prohibited diversity statements for hiring or admissions. House Bill 1006 in Texas prohibited funding for DEI offices. House Bill 3164 prohibited DEI offices or staff at public colleges and universities. So House Bill 1006 prohibited funding to be used for DEI offices. House Bill 3164 prohibited the existence of DEI offices or staff at public colleges and universities. Texas Senate Bill 2313 and House Bill 5001 would have prohibited DEI training as a condition of enrollment or course registration. And Texas House Bill 5140 would prohibit identity-based preferences in admissions. Utah House Bill 451 would prohibit diversity statements for hiring or admissions, and Utah Senate Bill 283 would prohibit funding for DEI offices. West Virginia House Bill 3503 would prohibit diversity statements for hiring, promotion, or admissions, would prevent the use of funds for DEI offices or staff, or using funds for DEI training, as well as prohibiting identity-based preferences. So we're putting in a lot of work to stop folks from engaging as we should engage, making space for people. So we're deciding that these are not things that we should invest in higher ed, which is kind of scary. And I'm not a politico, but if you think about one of the Republican platform tenets is small government, less registration or less regulation. This is very much the opposite of that, because this is a whole lot of regulation and a whole lot of government intervention into higher ed. So when we think about, okay, so if this is what's happening in higher ed, how does this impact us in the business industry? Well, one of the things to think about is legislation that is currently targeted towards higher ed will eventually, the pendulum will move and it will focus on industry and other areas. I think one of the next areas that we'll see this legislation is in K through 12, and then we will see it moving out to other areas of the country. So none of us are safe. Higher ed right now is the target, but it will not be the sole target for long. One of the things that will happen is the mindset of the talent that you will recruit in the next 5 to 10 years as these bills are passed. They will not be individuals who have been exposed to think about different perspectives. They will be talent that comes out with a very monolithic perspective, which does not help your ability to grow and prosper as industry. It will decrease retention because people don't want to be where there's not a space for them. It will also decrease the level of innovation and creativity that you have in the next 5 to 10 years, because the folks that you are hiring, coming into your businesses are not going to be thinking innovatively and creatively, because that requires the ability to look at other perspectives, other ways of being, and that's not something that they will have been exposed to in their education. It will limit problem-solving ability, because again, they're being exposed to very one-dimensional ways of thinking. So effective problem-solving requires someone to think outside the box. It also ultimately decreases profit, because if these things are going down, your profit goes down as well. This is a doom gloom, but this is kind of where we're going. When we start to censor people, we eventually begin to censor ourselves. And so this type of legislation, although it seems, oh, it's going to help prevent something we want to stop, eventually it even cripples what it is you're trying to, save, which is the idea of a white America. So I hope this was of use for you all. I have given Bobby and Rose a handout that literally shows these laws, the states, the status of the law, and kind of what the law talks about. I always encourage people. I have had the wonderful pleasure of actually sitting down and reading each of these laws in their entirety. Yes, I have a very boring life. But what we don't do is we listen to things on TV and go, oh, okay, that's what that says. No, read them for yourself so that you understand what they say and what the impact is if certain bills are passed. And I think that's the thing, is people aren't willing to do that. We take our sound bites from the news and go, okay, I know what that is. No, you don't. You know what the sound bite is, but take the time to actually look through these. Don't even take my word for it. Go and read these laws for yourselves. And the handout that I'm going to provide for you will show you where you can access those things. But this is, our country has had, and I'll just give you a brief history. So we had slavery. Slavery ended, and we had Reconstruction, where you now begin to see people who were oppressed begin to prosper. Oh, well, we can't have that. So enter Jim Crow law and mandatory segregation. We begin to desegregate schools, buses, businesses, and now we see white flight, where whites are moving out of city centers to the suburbs, leaving those who have less resources, so those city centers become decline. So you see what Derek Bell was looking at is there is a pattern here. A very interesting story I encourage you to look at is happening right now in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi is one of those places where white flight happened, and the downtown area of Jackson is declining because those resources have moved out. And so Jackson wants to recreate boundaries so that those resources, so the capital area can move out those limited resources and move back in those tax bases. So literally, again, segregating people, moving them out so that it can return to what it wanted to have once upon a time. These things are happening. And is it racism based on a moral thing, or is it based on business? I'm not going to argue either way of which one it is, but it is something that is happening in our nation. And if we are not willing as educators, as business leaders, to look at this and to speak out about it and to act in opposition to it, we will become complacent and become part of it. And then eventually we will also suffer from our complacency. So on that, I'm going to stop sharing and open up for questions. And I see lots of things happening in the chat. Okay. Okay. Any questions, comments, jokes? I'll take whatever you give me.
Yes, right before we get that, I just want to, I would just say, I want to thank Dr. McCorkle for sharing her experience and knowledge with us all today. And just remind everyone else that with questions, you can submit them via the chat, or there's also a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen as well that you could submit the questions there as well to get them answered.
We had one question, I think it was from Julia, says, what are the areas of hope? And again, I know this looks like doom and gloom, but everything has a season. And so these things too will pass. I think the area of hope is that we have 50 states. Less than half are moving these types of legislation. So the hope is those other states will continue to support DEI initiatives so that it balances out. And as we move into our national elections, that we will be active in lobbying so that these things don't happen. And I'll give you a good example. In 2016, when Donald Trump became president, one of the things that he did is he prohibited DEI training for all state agencies. And many of those agencies, for example, our military, Other agencies of the US government have begun to do DEI training for its staff. That became prohibited. There was talk of prohibiting funding. So those things became very scary. The one area of hope that we have that some of these legislations can also be challenged in the court is that many of these schools have federal grants which require DEI training and education. And so by having these laws, you are in direct violation of a federal grant, and a state law cannot be more prohibitive than a federal law. So some of these things may be challenged in the court. Also, when we look at federal financial aid, it is based on financial need, not race or gender or anything else. And so by attaching, there was one law I talked about where they wanted to ban certain things regarding financial aid. So some of these things can be challenged in the court and have these things decided in the court of law. So there is some hope. And then people can also talk with their resources. You know, people decide, well, I'm not going to send my child to school in such and such a state. I'm going to go here because of what's happening in that state. Florida is starting to see that now. There are lots of folks who are working at Florida institutions that are looking for jobs elsewhere, and not just folks who are working in DEI in Florida, but folks who DEI is important to them and they don't want to be in an environment which it's not. And so that's where we see our hope, is people are choosing to stand on their principles as opposed to being complacent. And there's one question, says, I do it with all the legislations, all the states level. What do you see the role of the U.S. Department of Education as DEI? The U.S. Department of Education has that influences on K through 12 more than it is in higher ed. And so one of the places is for the U.S. Department of Education to strongly uphold DEI in K through 12, which then again allows for, when state legislation starts moving to K through 12, allows it to be challenged in the court of law. The other area that helps higher ed is the fact that we have accrediting bodies. And as long as those accrediting bodies remain independent of state government, then those accrediting bodies can still enforce DEI as being something that if you want to be an accredited institution, you must follow certain things. And accreditation is helpful because for medical schools, law schools, anyone who is doing a degree in clinical psychology, counseling psychology, social work, physical therapy, physician's assistants, any of those things that require licensure need to be accredited programs in order to qualify for licensure. So that's where we have some of this is going to have to play out in the court of law, where these bills are going to be challenged as unconstitutional because they're violating pre-existing things. I hope that answered your question, Christy. Okay, one other question. Are there additional impacts you foresee impacting business as a result of current and future legislation rolling back DEI efforts? What are some actions we can take to support DEI in the future? As I said, yes, I see legislation, that pendulum moving to attack other areas of society with legislation. I think one of the things that business can do is start having that be something that is required for hiring. We want talent that comes with this knowledge. Therefore, institutions of higher ed are going to have to be able to provide that in order for people to get hired. So the mighty dollar speaks very loud. So if the economy is saying we want DEI talent, then institutions are going to have to do that, which means state legislatures are going to have to change and reverse some of these bills. So that's how business can support DEI, is by making it something that you value and want to see in the talent that you are bringing in. Sarah asked if there was a way to share this with her organization. I think the recording is going to be made available. So I would say, Sarah, I would definitely have a brown bag lunch and share the recording and have a discussion. There is a question: if we view this from a governor's perspective, why do we need more regulation to fix the CRT DI issue that appears to be a non-issue? Well, it is a non-issue because it's not a threat to anything. But think about it. If I want a particular narrative to be the narrative of choice, then I have to eliminate other narratives. And so this is where a lot of this legislation is coming from. It is not coming out of the fact that CRT and DEI is a danger. It is that it is proposing other narratives. And I want a particular narrative to be seen. And some of it goes back to just looking at our history as a nation. The US is made up of very diverse individuals. And so we have no one narrative when we talk about the history of our country. It is a quilt of narratives, but we don't like that. We want a very clear, crisp narrative because a quilt has many colors. It's not necessarily uniform and can be distracting. So we want to move away from that and have one crisp narrative, but that's not what it actually is. So if you're looking at this from a governor's perspective, I would say you don't need CRT and DEI legislation against that. Instead, you should welcome the fact of being able to show the diversity of narratives that we have as a country. It makes for us to be a much more enriched country and a much more flavorful country. That's why we like, stews over mashed potatoes. There's a little bit more flavor in them. Okay. Well, I think I answered all the questions or answered them to the best of my ability. I do greatly appreciate each of you for engaging with this information. Again, these are not fun, warm, cozy topics, but this is reality. I've been doing DEI work for most of my career, and it is not fun holding a mirror to one another and holding us accountable. But if we are to survive, and the fact that this organization has sustainability in its title, in order to sustain, we must make space for everybody. Sustainability can't be, well, we eliminate certain folks and keep certain ones. In order to be sustainable, all of us must be able to coexist and be respected. I like to say DEI is simply about learning how to see, hear, and value one another. It is not about promoting a particular political idea. It is about seeing, hearing, and valuing one another. And as humans, that is all each of us want to experience, is to be seen, heard, and valued. And if we are able to do that and teach people how to do that, why would we not want to do that?
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Candy McCorkle. And I want to thank everyone else here for attending this webinar. If you found this very, very valuable today, please consider becoming a member or checking out our website for other upcoming webinars and other opportunities at our website at misbf.org. And once again, I want to thank Dr. Candy for being able to talk about this very important matter and the attack on our public and private institutions in regards to DEI. One thing I want to leave you all with as well is that I know by 2030, it does state that the majority population will be at 55% and continuously dwindling all the way through to 2030. So with that type of diversity coming down the pipeline, being able to make sure that we have diversity in our hiring practices, diversity in our organization, and to really value diversity and lived experiences is going to be even more important and valuable, especially with our population in the United States, at least, being able to be such a large diversity of ethnicities, race, sexual orientations, all the above, coming down as soon as 6 years from now, right now. So let's make sure that we keep that in front of mind to be able to continue to push this type of of work in DEI and showing the importance of that and within all our organizations that we all are at and continue to promote it, because it takes a community to make sure to create long-lasting impact when it comes to this work. I want to thank you all once again for joining, and I look forward to, I will be sending out some meeting notes at the recording of this, and also a handout Dr. McCorkle put together for us all as well. And I will have all that sent out to every attendee on this via email. So look forward to that, and looking forward to speaking with you all and maybe working together in the future. Thank you all.
And I just recommend that you all check out the book, The Color of Law, if you really want to begin to see what happens when we don't adhere to these things.
Thank you all. You all have a good rest of your day and good week.